Just to catch everyone up as a background to Giallo Gelato, what is Giallo cinema and why are they significant?
All wonderful questions, Pat. Thank you for asking. Giallo cinema started in Italy as a post-war response to the films of Hitchcock, the books of Agatha Christie, and a general feeling of Italy no longer being in war, a backwater country, and they had beautiful people and all sorts of cameras. Hence the Giallo. Giallos were made between, let's say, 60 and 80, of course, with some proto-Gialli and some neo-Gialli before and after those years. The main years are arguably 1965 to 1975. And because films that were released in 75 are celebrating their 50th anniversary this year, I thought, why not have a birthday party for my favorite genre of film? I am showing 4 films. Candidly, some of them aren't that important. But of course, every film worth seeing both captures and transcends a moment, and all 4 of these definitely do. Whether it's women at work, the technology available, the common preoccupations, ongoing shifting relationships with women's rights. So each of these films kind of delves into the director's perspective of what he was thinking and feeling at the moment.
Why were the 1970s the ripest time for the Giallo movement? What distinguishes that era from any other for these types of films?
If you look at the timing of when the Gialli really began to flourish, which let's say is 68, 67, 69, it really comes down to the fact that the people making these films in Italy had classical training in how to make a film, how to light a film. Of course, cinema has long driven Italy's modern artistic output. We're still watching films from the great Italian masters. However, it was the age of the people who were making them. Essentially, these people were baby boomers, and they were dealing with massive changes. Do recall that Italy became a republic only in 1955, which was functionally 5 or 6 years after maybe 5 or 10 years after the war ended.
Mhm.
And by the time the 70s rolled around, they were finally free of a fascist dictatorship. The money was there, tourism was kicking in, and interestingly, film was a state-sponsored activity, unlike the auteurs and the cowboys of Hollywood in the 70s, who were sort of seen as wild men or freaks. Making films in Italy was like being a doctor or a lawyer. Families got into the business. So you had the social cachet of being a director, you had all sorts of access to the best technology, and they had visions, ideas, script writers, cinematographers. It was really just the perfect meeting of the minds and the time.
Excellent. Um, in your point of view, what are the top ingredients for a Giallo cinema film? What is necessary in its makeup to say, ah, yeah, that is Giallo?
You know, lots of people have tried to answer that question. And similar to pornography, I think you kind of know a giallo when you see it. But there are definitely some key points, some main ingredients, as you said. The first main ingredient is there has to be a murder mystery, whether or not we know who the killer is right off the rip, whether or not we know who the killer is halfway through the film, or whether or not there's a big reveal at the end. An Agatha Christie type murder mystery is an essential component to a classic giallo. Another classic component are morally ambiguous, beautiful people. The stars of giallo are so attractive. The camera just loves them. Each of the women is more beautiful than the next. each of the men are more handsome and dashing and sinister than the next. And seeing those morally ambiguous, beautiful people doing terrible things to each other is one of the pure pleasures of Giallo. And I'd say to round it out, it has to look beautiful. Gialli are often driven by colors, lights, the cinematography. And of course, these films were made to be watched in a theater. So the way that they look sometimes really factors in when people say that Jolly are often more style than substance, and they're not wrong.
What quirks in your personality makes it best conducive to be an expert in Giallo? And at what time of life did you discover the genre?
I have always, I will tell you what I don't like first. I don't like simple narratives with happy endings, particularly that of rom-coms or a general comedy. I don't like when people end up together at the end. I don't like when the guy gets the girl. I find those types of films in their own way really insulting. Unfortunately, I also don't like, interestingly enough, action or much violence, which also drives Hollywood and to a lesser or greater extent the American film market.
Sure.
Right off the rip, Pat, I've always been drawn to complex stories of an emotional journey, usually seeded with pain, trauma, anguish. I love when people are going through something and we get to join them in that journey, good, bad, or otherwise. In terms of when I started really getting into Gialli, I've always been on the cusp of it. For example, when I was in my formative teenage years, I saw a lot of what we would call Americano or Giallo Americano. I watched a ton of Hitchcock. I watched a ton of De Palma. I watched a ton of this sort of sleazy films coming out of New York City. And they've just always appealed to me, not only of the way that they look, but because the characters aren't necessarily relatable. They're not good, they're not bad, they just are. And I think Italy being a post-war country with all sorts of pressures and problems as they moved into a modern tourist driven beautiful country, that psychology was really captured by the Gialli. And I started understanding it the older I got, because as I learned more about the war, about women's rights, about how Italy had evolved between the 50s and the 70s, as a grown up, basically during the pandemic, I just decided my passion is Italian horror and I am going to dive straight into it.
Very good. Finally, is it possible today to make a Giallo film? And what is a perfect example, either another country based or Italian based, from let's say the last 15 years?
Neo-Gialli have been a very interesting sub genre. Obviously, I'm not the only one who's super into the aesthetics, into the narratives, into the classic Gialli tropes. I would say, interestingly, that Europe is really putting out the best Neo-Gialli, which can't really surprise anyone. And of all countries, France in 2018 put out a film called Knife and Heart. And it's got that lurid technicolor. It's actually set in the 70s on a porn shoot. It's a female director who's dealing with her own sexual anxieties, her own personal preoccupations. And it was filmed by a man and a woman who are a directing duo. And I think that the way that they handled the colors, the beats, the plot, the reveal, that is one of the best examples of a neo-giallo.
This is Patrick McDonald for HollywoodChicago.com. Copyright 2025.